Now we need to think, where do we want our code that calls OpenAI's API to go? Well, what are our choices? It can either go in backend, pages, or public. Now, we're going to need to share private information with OpenAI to authenticate ourselves with them. And we're going to need to send them our API key. So we obviously don't want to put that code in the front end. We don't want our users to be able to see what our API key is. So we'll have to do it in the backend code. So in the backend code, I'm going to create a new file. I'll call it, let's say, prompthandler.jsw. Now we need to think about, what do we want to put in this prompt handler module? So essentially, I want a function I can call from the front end that will return a freshly generated scary story. Obviously, to do that on the back end, it's going to need to send an API request to OpenAI, wait for OpenAI to generate the scary story, and then send it back to the front end. So we need to export a function. The other thing we know about that function is that it's an async function, because it's going to send a request to OpenAI, and we don't control what's happening there. We'll have to wait until OpenAI sends us a response. So we can name our function, let's say, get scary story. Now this is really funny. I'm using GitHub Copilot, and look what it's suggesting to me. So it's thinking, okay, this function get scary story, well, what's it going to do? Should probably go to Reddit, right? And I honestly wonder if this will work, but I don't have the time to try it out. If anyone wants to try this, let me know how it goes. But what we're going to do is to use the OpenAI SDK. So let's do const OpenAI, let's say client, and new OpenAI API. We already installed the package, so IntelliJ was able to give us this completion. Now you can see if I hover over here that the constructor is expecting a configuration object. And what this configuration object needs is the OpenAI key. GitHub Copilot gave me this completion. And that's an excellent idea if you are hosting this on an EC2 instance on AWS, let's say, or any other environment. You obviously don't want to hard code your API key into the code, especially if your code is on GitHub. There are many issues with that. For example, let's say even this project, if I want to open source it so all of you can see it once I'm done this video series, I don't want my personal OpenAI API key to be in the code. So what you do is you access an environment variable. And this is a common way to do that with process.env.openai. And then you just have a file in your project that you call .env that you put into git ignore, and you never commit that. However, for cloud hosting platforms, a common pattern is to have some sort of secrets manager. So that gives you some kind of UI to work with, where you can store your secrets in the cloud provider and then access your secrets from as many websites or apps as you're hosting on that cloud provider as you want. And it just so happens to be that Wix is one of those platforms that does have a secrets manager. So we're going to use that. So this we don't want. Instead, we're going to get our API key from the Wix Secrets Manager. So I'm going to name a const, let's say API key. And then instead of doing process environment, we'll do await get secret. And then we need to pass in the name that we gave our key in the Wix Secrets Manager, which we'll do in a minute. So don't worry. And then over here, we're just going to pass it that API key. This, of course, should not be inside over here. It needs to be up here. Let's go through this one more time. In this line, we're fetching our OpenAI API key, which we are storing in the Wix Secrets Manager under this name. Now, we didn't do that yet. We're going to do that in the next step. You could do it in the opposite order. This is just the way I happen to go. And then we're going to create a API client, an object that we're going to use to communicate with OpenAI's API. And we're going to pass it this configuration object, which has a API key, and its value is the value, our actual API key that we fetched from the Wix Secrets Manager. Okay, of course, we also need to import this great get secret method, and we import it like this, not from secrets, but from Wix Secrets backend. And let's actually extract this. Let's extract it to a constant in the enclosing scope. And then I'm going to do shift function F6. And let's call this configuration. And it actually needs to be a configuration object. What I'm going to do is just this. VS Code automatically added the configuration in the import. This needs a closing parentheses. Okay. What else do we have here? Okay, the value is never used. All right, so now we should have a OpenAI client ready to send requests. So let's try that. Now at this point, if we had our Open API key set, so then at this point, we would have an OpenAI client ready to make requests. So let's set that up. Let's do let response. And what we actually want over here is this create completion. So I think this should actually be model. And we want Da Vinci, but it's actually text Da Vinci -02 or 003. And you can actually use the new chat completion API, but I haven't played with that much, so I'm just gonna use this, but feel free to try that out. And you would just use create chat completion, I think. Okay, next we're gonna need our prompt. I'm actually just gonna paste this in, and essentially what that's doing is it's saying 2-sentence horror story, and then it says this short 2-sentence horror story, and then it just says the beginning 2-sentence horror story. And I'm hoping that the AI will realize this is a pattern. These are headings, 2-sentence horror story, then a horror story. So it's gonna assume that what comes next is probably another 2-sentence horror story. And that is what it's gonna return. So that's the aim with this prompt. And we need to set max tokens. So that's 100. That's basically we pay per token. The chat completions API is cheaper. This is not very expensive, but if it's being used by many people, it can add up. So we have max tokens, 100. Basically, it's like setting a budget. It's also relevant if for a specific reason you want your result to be a certain length, short or long. And now we want the temperature. So temperature is basically how wide of a range we're giving the AI permission to act in. Like how much do we want it to be play it super safe and stay very close to our prompt, and how much permission we're giving it to go out of the bounds. So the higher the temperature, the more varied the responses are, the more willing it will be to take risks and be creative. The lower the temperature, the safer its responses are going to be, but also the more boring and similar they'll be to each other. Okay, top P is another parameter, which we're not going to get into at the moment, at least. Then we have frequency penalty, which is if you don't want it to be repetitive, we don't want it to be super repetitive. That's in a single response. And then presence penalty. Okay, so we don't need to get into all of these parameters now. There's a typo there. Why is this red? Oh, we need a comma over here. Okay. We don't need to get into all of this now. The main things are the model, the prompt, and the temperature. I guess max tokens also. Okay. All right. And then we want to return the response.data.choices. And I'm only expecting one choice. So it should be the first choice in the array or the only choice in the array and text. And that is going to be the actual response. Okay, and we want to return that. All right, this looks pretty much ready to go. We're ready to use this function in our front end, in the home page, to fetch the scary story when the page loads. We do need to remember to set this secret in the Wix Secrets Manager with our OpenAI API key.